My name is Lucy Zoria, and I'm the program manager at America House Kyiv, and I am currently in Kyiv, and this is where I'm from. So we had just launched our peer mentoring program called Windows to Success, Women's Career Club. And it's a 6-month mentoring program where women gather and they work together to develop their professional and personal lives. And it was a really great meeting. Everyone was so inspired, but also kind of, thinking about everything in the context because the tension had been mounting for a couple of years. So I finished around 9 o'clock and I was just so tired and I just had time to kind of grab a bite to eat and then go to bed. And I woke up on the 24th at around 6:30. And I woke up because my neighbors, my downstairs neighbors, they were running around the apartment. And we have very good windows, but we have very thin walls. So I immediately understood that this is kind of strange. They do have kids, but they're usually not running around at 6:30. And so I grabbed my phone and I saw a message from my mother at around 5:30 who was asking me if I was asleep, and I quickly checked the news and I realized what was going on. And so I woke my husband, and really within 25 minutes we had our go bags, we had our dog, and we got in our car. We were among those people who were expecting something to happen sooner or later. So everything had already been ready for weeks, kind of waiting for the right moment. So my family and I, we had a plan that we would all join each other kind of in one spot. And, within a couple of hours, we were all there. But the traffic in the city was horrible, particularly in the western direction that went to Bucha, to Irpin, and the Zhytomyr road that would head kind of straight to Lviv. All of that was just packed. Thankfully, we were moving in a different direction, but it still took a lot longer than we were expecting to get there. And very quickly, we realized that basically in a situation like that, you have two options. You either leave, or basically, there can come a time when it's too dangerous to leave, when you have to shelter in place. So we understood that with all of the traffic, it just wouldn't be a good idea to go out on the road and to get stuck in the middle of nowhere. And already the first news were coming in that there was already heavy fighting and heavy bombing around Gostomel. And so we decided we would stay in place for the day and leave the next day. And really, all I remember from the first day is being I couldn't eat a thing. You were just constantly checking the news, checking where everything was. My head really hurt, which is really strange because that rarely happens to me. And I was nauseous the entire day. And in the evening, so we all gathered, and it's kind of me, my husband, my mother, my extended family. And in the evening, we had a big dinner together, kind of with the understanding that this would be the last time in quite a while that we would all be gathered together. And, almost a year later, that is the case. My entire family is kind of spread all around the world. Everyone's in different places, and it took lots of time to get there, but that was how it was. And then we were planning to leave right after the curfew ended, so around 5 o'clock in the morning, and we woke up in the middle of the night from explosions on the left bank. And where we were, you kind of had a very nice view of the town, so it was just a very when you ask someone what happened on the 24th, still people, they go through the steps. First this happened, that happened. And that's kind of just part of trying to still figure out what actually happened. So when I left, I can't say that I was planning to leave Ukraine. I think that some people had that plan in mind. Most people in my circle really didn't want to, or even if they ended up somewhere abroad, they do it for a variety of reasons. For some of my friends, it's because their husbands, or their partners, they're serving in the military, and it's a request from their partners to keep their children safe so that they feel safe, so that they don't have to worry about them and they can just do the job that they have to. For me personally, it was also a combination of family responsibilities. For myself, a very long time ago, I made this decision that for me, the threat of occupation is the only thing that would ultimately make me leave. Like everything else is fine. Like that is something, maybe I've been through personally, or I've been in situations, it's not kind of Ukraine's first experience with this. The war has been going on for 9 years. And through the Maidan in Kyiv, the situation also wasn't the easiest. But I did leave for a time, and I stayed in Germany for some months. I made sure that kind of the rest of my family was settled, and I just didn't know what I was doing there. And it was important for me to come back to be with my husband and to come home. Most people I know, they want to come home. They can't for different reasons. Some people don't have where to go back home. Or even worse, they don't have who to come home to, just because the destruction has been so large scale. But as for me personally, I can't say that I have such a unique perspective on the war. I feel like everyone has unique perspectives. And as for work at America House, and in the American spaces particularly, for us, it has definitely reflected on our programming. We are very much focused on skill building, community building, mental health support, English language learning, the kind of programs that were always the backbone of our work, in cultural diplomacy and in general supporting Ukrainians and Ukrainian youth. These are skills that they can use to be successful in any type of environment. But now in particular, because the war, any experience of war is so all-encompassing, you can't ignore it. It just seeps into every aspect of your life, and it can be quite difficult to get your work done. We have air sirens, our work is interrupted. When we have missile strikes, electricity, heating, everything goes away, and you have to plan your life around, finding a mobile signal or, juicing up your computer so that you can do some of your work. But everyone is kind of in the same situation here right now, so people are very understanding, but it can get pretty tiring when you have to, reschedule things at a moment's notice, and really just regular day-to-day things become just these impossible tasks. Just meeting with someone, it can be quite difficult. So, but as for kind of a change in understanding, I would say that in our sphere, in where we work, and related fields, culture, education, diplomacy, any kind of community building, I think that there is a reinvigorated understanding of how crucial our work is. It is definitely something that is of great importance, and we have a lot of work to do both internally and outside of the country. And on kind of the international sphere, we have so much work to do that my colleagues have been trying to do, but we have been working through a type of exclusion and invisibility of Ukraine on the international stage for decades now. And right now we have to move past, being a token or the tokenism of the moment of Ukraine, and to really find ourselves and take our place as equal partners, equal collaborators, just in that space of academia, culture, diplomacy, international relations in general. And internally, there is just so much work to be done. We are still processing the trauma of centuries of colonization, of genocide, and cultural appropriation that has been just weaponized by Russia in its historical and contemporary forms. So I do think that the work is more important than ever. And a lot of my colleagues, I think, would say that they feel similarly. And we are definitely united in this goal of supporting Ukraine get through this and get us to the next moment. I think that, on one hand, Ukrainian women are facing the same challenges that Ukrainians face, whether it be abroad or inside the country. If we're talking about the women who relocated abroad, it's very difficult for me to say the word refugee because of the special status, first of all, that kind of the special protection that was awarded to Ukrainians. And second of all, in Ukrainian, we have a different word. We do have kind of the direct translation of the word refugee, but we also have вимушені переселенці, and that means those who are forced to migrate. And that does have kind of a different ring. That is how that is the term that we use for everyone who is displaced as a result of the war. So for the women who had to leave for the various circumstances, on one hand, they say they face the same kind of dangers that any kind of displaced and vulnerable population faces. And that is definitely exploitation, sexual violence, trafficking. There have already been reported cases all around Europe in the last 12 months. And that is definitely a topic that is, it exists. It is a challenge. And there are many other challenges for women who left. On one hand, they are now the primary caregivers, whether it's for their elderly parents or for their children. For young women, they've had to become parents to their parents because they're kind of the elderly generation might not know English as well or any other languages, and they really have to leave their youth behind and grow up very quickly. They have to build new lives in completely new surroundings without understanding the language perhaps. And many people, they did not exactly choose where they ended up. It happens in a long chain of very strange events that you find yourself somewhere, someplace, somehow, either with friends or with complete strangers, and you have to start building a new life. And any type of long-term migration is tricky, but it is, especially difficult in these circumstances. And Ukrainian women in general are very highly educated. And they find themselves, underpaid, overqualified, and it's not clear for how long this entire situation is. So you're expected to build a new life, but there are no guarantees. Will you be asked to leave? And it's very, there are millions of us, and so the experiences are very vast. And for as many, women that have decided to leave, just as many have decided to stay behind or come back. And the dangers are also not insignificant. We always know that with any kind of military action or military aggression, there is always the threat of sexual violence. There are rising cases of domestic violence. There are the dangers of, everything from missile strikes But I would say the threat of occupation is the greatest danger of all, because in every territory that has been liberated from Russia, there have been found mass graves, torture chambers, missing persons, and just evidence of horrific crimes and war crimes. So I would say that for Ukrainian women, it's not easy in any option, but it's the same for any Ukrainian citizens. Ukrainian women generally have the choice to leave unless they have any kind of military specialty or if they're a doctor. And for millions of men, they do not have the option to leave, except in very rare cases. So the gender discussion is definitely worth having, but there are also some, I think, interesting moments that can be definitely studied, although they're not surprising to me. All of the women that have come back or have returned in every community all across Ukraine, you can find women being organizers, fundraisers, logistics managers, and they're performing so much volunteer work, and that is in addition to being, primary caregivers, again, because so many families have been divided either by space or by military conscription or any type of other, I would say, the many challenges that we have. And at the same time, an unprecedented number of women in Ukrainian history are signing up for military service. In 2021, the numbers were around 30,000, and this was already after a sizable spike in voluntary military enrollment from women after the start of the war in 2014. By fall 22, the number was around 50,000. And this was around 38,000 women who already have military specialties and around 13,000 women who are civilians, but they perform job duties within the armed forces. And the latest numbers that I saw in December of 22, it is almost 60,000 women. And this is after it was announced in the fall that they would be expanding kind of the list of military roles that women can participate in. And in 2016, there was a special law brought into motion that made kind of the previously prohibited list of duties that women could perform in the military. Basically, it just became allowed. And that was also a consequence of the start of the war in 2014. So actually the latest, the numbers that I've seen, and I think this was before the last wave of mobilization that significantly increased the overall numbers of the Ukrainian army. But before that, 22% of our total army of the Ukrainian armed forces were women. And this is among the highest percentages in European countries and in general in countries that have voluntary military service. So I think this is a very good illustration of how the women of Ukraine have responded to the challenges. And that is, as a whole, it just shows that for Ukrainians, this is a problem that it's a challenge for all of us. This is not something that we can delegate to someone else. There's an army somewhere there, or there's a job to be done, someone else can take care of it. It's a very Ukrainian can-do attitude, and also the understanding that there is no one else who can actually free us from this. It's all up to us. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, I couldn't help smiling at the words "personal plans for the future." Wouldn't it be nice to have them in general? But The war in Ukraine has been going on for 9 years. And in this span, entire generations have made the transition from childhood to young adulthood to being full-fledged adults, parents. And I myself, I was 24 when the war began. I'm 31 now. And the majority of my adulthood was shaped with the start of the war. And this is something that has followed me ever since. And I would say, I don't know, it's like, what can I tell you about my personal sense of security or the security of other Ukrainians? It's just, in Ukraine, entire cities and villages have been destroyed, just entirely leveled. And the scale of destruction is so hard to fathom. Like, you see the videos, you see the visuals, you learn about the war through all of these things, but it's an entirely different thing, to go to Irpin and stand in the apartment of your friend that is just entirely burned out and is just entirely destroyed, or to go to your other friend and, hold in your size like a bullet shell, like the size of your fist, that the Russian army shot straight through her house. And just being in places like that, you understand the scale of the destruction and how senseless it is and how entirely indiscriminately brutal it is. And I think that everyone makes their own choices within this life that we have, and it's a life that's entirely built on managing instability, extreme resilience out of necessity. And in that sense, we're not different to any other culture or people who are going through the experience of war. You can find similar stories or similar types of behaviors and patterns anywhere in Syria, in the Balkans, anywhere where there are kind of recent memories or recent history where you can talk to people. It's a very bonding experience, I would say. There's an immediate understanding when I talk to people who are not Ukrainians, but who have been through something similar. And the thing is that, despite everything going on, Ukrainians are going to work. They continue to study because what can you do in the moment? It's just you have to keep on living your life. Cities that were still, experiencing kind of missile attacks, they still renovate the houses because we can't wait for it to be over. It's been going on for 9 years. Like, there is no other time. So you really live in this little carpe diem moment. But still, many people make the choice to leave. And I know enough people who have lost their entire lives for the second time. People who left Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk in 2014 and 2015, and they moved to places like Mariupol, Irpin, Bucha, to Rubizhne, to Lysychansk. And for the second time in 9 years, they lose their entire lives, their homes, their livelihoods, their families. And for some people, it's just too much. They can't imagine having to start again a third time or a fourth time. And at the same time, I know people who went through that experience and they just sit in Ukraine and they say, I'm never leaving. Like, they have to take me out of here. Or it's because it's their home and they've lost it enough times. And same as, as for Ukrainians, Ukraine has become a home for, again, the word, refugees, but we have hosted a population of people who ran from the war in Abkhazia, also supported by Russia in the beginning of the 90s. Again, and for them, it's also the second time. We have refugees from Syria, from Afghanistan. And it's truly just horrible what everyone is going through. But in terms of, long-term or short-term plans, I think, irregardless of where they are or how are they planning their life. Are they trying to find a way to stay somewhere else, or if they hope to return to Ukraine as soon as they can? I think that the short-term plan is survive and live to see a Ukrainian victory. Kind of, you only have plans in general terms. It's very difficult to, you write timelines. Particularly in work, you try to set some plans, but you also have to live in this life of constant change and be ready to change it. And that in itself is just so entirely tiring. But it is very difficult even to have these. I think it's a luxury, it's a luxury to be able to plan long term, to look ahead. And I would say that there are people who do that very well. They deal with changing circumstances. There are people who don't do that very well. But in general, it's one thing that I wanted to say is that even with kind of all of the horror that's going on, and it is a fact that with the war, decades of growth, of potential, and millions of paths and futures have been stolen from us, and they have been taken from us. And this is one of the greatest crimes of the Russian Federation, along with the other 100,000 war crimes that they have committed. But even in the face of that, I would say for millions, right now, there is a hope that we did not have 7, 8, 9 years ago. And the hope is that some of them might be able to return home, actually. That one day they might be able to go home to Crimea, that they might be able to go home to Donetsk and to Luhansk. And it's really that future towards all Ukrainians work for, and it's a hope for a future in which Ukrainians and everyone who has chosen Ukraine to be their home, and our language and our culture and the multitude of cultures that live here, actually, that we can all exist in safety. And it's also a striving to end a circle of centuries of conflict that has been brought to Ukraine through Russia and from them. And I would say that is the main personal plan that I have. And that is just me. And again, everyone makes their own choices. And I know that many people, there's been a lot of talk about the externally displaced people of Ukraine who have been abroad. And I've seen numbers around 7 million. But not many, I haven't seen it quite as often referenced, the 12 million displaced people that remain in Ukraine. And this is a territory that is quite large. We are, comparatively the size of Texas, the size of France. And these are all people who try to find new lives in their new surroundings. This is just my personal kind of views. In 10 years, we will be a sovereign, independent country, completely within the bounds of our 1991 borders. That is the goal, and that is the way it will be, and that is the way that it should be, not only for the interest of Ukraine, but for the interest of lasting peace within Europe and the world. I believe that it's a result of deliberate exclusion and erasure that Ukraine's role and historical role in Europe and Europe's stability and unity has been downplayed or entirely, left out of the conversation. The Russian academic narrative has entirely dominated, and there is a reason for that. Centuries and decades of soft power, carbon fascism, that is the result when we allow these narratives to flourish, and when we talk about, the kind of the big players emitting everything that is around it, and when we allow their viewpoint to dominate the conversation. So that is my view, my hope, and it's really the way that I truly believe that it should be, that Ukraine remains completely sovereign, that we have strong relationships to our neighbors. I'm not going to comment on Russia, because any talk of a potential relationship can come only after war tribunals, reparations, and acknowledgement of everything that has been done to us. Then maybe we can talk. But in any case, I do think that Ukraine has a role to play in the Eastern Partnership. I think that our experience is on one hand unique, but on the other hand entirely characteristic. And there are lessons that maybe we should have learned historically as neighbors, as a global society, but that weren't learned, and that we should really try to learn them as best as we can. Well, first of all, I think that the issue of the denial of Ukrainian agency is a very large one. And this is something that we come up against, and my colleagues who try to work internationally and travel abroad come into all of the time. It can't possibly be us. It can't possibly be Ukrainians making these choices. And this actually really plays into the Russian propaganda narrative that we are not smart enough, or that we're just stupid, we're uncivilized, we're barbarians, we have no idea what we're talking about. And I have to tell you that the term West-splaining has become very common in conversations in Ukraine around this issue. This does exist, and that is one dimension of the problem. The other one is that historically, and I would recommend reading Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands to anyone who is interested in comparing kind of the historical context and learning more about the historical background of Ukraine. I think that for countries like Ukraine, like Poland, like Estonia, like Latvia, like Lithuania, like Georgia, our experience of the Soviet Union and Soviet occupation was very different from Germany. It was much more long-lasting, and it definitely was not the same in terms of intensity, outright genocide that we suffered, and the cultural appropriation that was seen and the level of it. And I think that when people think that they know an experience and it wasn't that bad, they think that they can kind of compare their experience to one that they don't really know a lot about. And I think that is kind of the point where people really don't understand the historical context and the colonial history of the Russian Empire and the colonial nature of the Soviet Union and the absolutely colonial and imperial nature that still exists within the Russian Federation today. And without that context, without that understanding of the historical, cultural, and social factors going into that, it's really difficult to see within it. And there, I think, I think there's a very clear reason why the reaction of the post-Soviet states that are closer to Russia is so different from Western states who did not have that experience in general. And as for how to talk with people and try to find their empathy, I mean, this is really, I don't remember who said this, but someone said, this is a question for a psychiatrist. Just the level of disinformation and propaganda that we've seen, it's gone into a really cult-like territory. And again, because Ukraine has had this experience for centuries. If you look at historical documents from the beginning of the 20th century, when within first the Russian Empire, but then the Soviet kind of Soviet Union system, when they were fighting against Ukrainian nationalists, you read the language and you compare it to what is being said today, it is the same language. We've been in this for so long, and I think right now it's hard for me to say exactly what has changed, but I remember this very clearly. At the start of the war and during Maidan, the level of disinformation was no less. But the problem was no one was ready to actually believe Ukrainians or to be interested in our story. It was just completely dominated by the Russian narrative. And it's also, a matter of becoming more and more emboldened by these lies. You can show, there's so much work being done around disinformation. But I do think that just because we've had much longer historical perspective as a people with it, we are more adept at spotting it. And that doesn't mean, here, whatever they are telling you in your sphere, there are the same type of kind of information wars that are being fought, at the same time here within our country. But, if you tell someone, someone in Ukraine, they executed a Russian speaker, someone would laugh in Ukraine because we know that that is ridiculous. But if you tell someone abroad that they executed a Russian speaker or someone that doesn't know Ukraine, they're like, oh yeah, that completely makes sense. And that plays into cultivated decades and centuries again of this Ukrainian image. And Russia has worked a lot. You can see this in even the historical kind of data and how they have positioned themselves in the Second World War. The Russians are those who fought against fascism, but the collaborators are always Ukrainians. It's a language that they use in any kind of, any kind of, I would say, contribution or really, anything great is theirs and anything bad is ours, or it belongs to Belarus, or it belongs to Georgia. It's a completely different thing, and they have been very effective in exporting kind of their brand of misinformation, because one of kind of the most effective strategies that they have is just flooding the space with noise. It's just, they give you 20 different versions that are so ridiculous, and it really preys on that kind of, Western Enlightenment tradition that individuals cultivate their analytical skills, and they take one source of information and they take another and they compare them, and it can't be, there has to be a grain of truth somewhere, or it's in the middle. This is what we learned very early on dealing with Russia. There is no truth in there. But because this is a very natural and cultivated kind of reaction, it really does prey on it. Or you're so flooded with the information that you think, oh God, this is too complicated. I'm not going to look into it at all. And people just tune out, and tuning out and becoming apolitical is also one of their greatest strategies. I'm just not going to do that. And for a long time, Ukrainians were apolitical because our agency was taken away, but we took it back through the Orange Revolution, through the Maidan, and earlier before in the 90s, through the revolution on the granite, which was led by students. Ukraine has a long tradition of protesting and searching for the truth. And one of the biggest moments was actually Chernobyl, because it was such a horrific thing, and the lies were so just out of this world, and the impact was so negative. There is no kind of surprise to me that the glasnost, kind of the historical period where it was, the liberalization of media in the Soviet Union, that it coincided with Chernobyl and kind of that period, the end of the Soviet Union, because there was no containing that. The search for the truth within Ukrainian society around Chernobyl and the need for it was so powerful that it moved it forward.
What really struck with me in terms of so the threat of occupation and this whole like Ukrainian voices matter, and that's kind of like the takeaway, like take our perspective seriously. I think that really touches to the core of many of the somewhat pseudo-neutral conversations people are having in Germany about the war, and or like even in the US, right? Connecting it to the Enlightenment theory in terms of like there must be like a grain of truth on the other side and stuff, like all these very elaborate placeholder conversations people are having in order to outmaneuver actually talking about the war and the atrocities is a really interesting perspective. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. Really, it was my pleasure, and thank you for really approaching kind of your programming in this program in a very thoughtful way.